Imagine being told exactly how you're going to die, in plain language, with a clear explanation of why, and choosing to walk into it anyway. That's basically what happened to Rome in the summer of 216 BC. 80,000 soldiers marched onto a flat plain near a small town called Cannae to crush an invading army of about 50,000 men. By the end of that single day, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans were dead. Not over a campaign, not over a war. In one afternoon. It remains one of the bloodiest single days any army has ever suffered in the history of organized warfare. And the strangest part isn't the death toll. The strangest part is that someone had already warned him in complete detail exactly how this would happen. And Rome ignored him.
His name was Quintus Fabius Maximus. And he wasn't some mystic muttering vague prophecies. He was a general who laid out, step by step, precisely why marching a massive army into open battle against the enemy commander was going to end in disaster. The Senate heard him out, basically told him to sit down. So what happened? How did the one man who actually understood the threat get pushed aside right when Rome needed him most? And why did it take one of the worst massacres in ancient history for anyone to admit he'd been right all along? This is the story of a general who won a war by refusing to fight a single battle. And it might be one of the most important lessons in strategy ever recorded.
To understand why Fabius looks like an absolute genius in hindsight, you first need to understand exactly who he was up against. Because without that context, his caution looks like cowardice. With it, his caution looks like the only sane choice available to anyone. The man causing all this chaos was Hannibal Barca, born in Carthage around 247 BC, the son of a general who had already fought Rome to a standstill once before. According to ancient historians, Hannibal's father made him swear an oath of eternal hatred toward Rome before he was even a teenager. And whether that story is exactly true or slightly exaggerated, Hannibal spent his entire life acting like it was gospel. By his late 20s, he was already commanding armies in Spain. And he wasn't just skilled, he was something rarer. He had genuine strategic imagination. He didn't just want to win fights, he wanted to win the whole war. In 218 BC, Hannibal did something nobody thought was even possible. He took an army of roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000.
At the Trebia River, Roman forces were outmaneuvered and slaughtered, losing around 20,000 men. A few months later, near Lake Trasimene, a Roman army marched straight into one of the most devastating ambushes in military history. Hannibal had hidden his troops in the hills above a fog-covered road, and when the Romans marched through without proper scouting, they were hit from 3 sides simultaneously, trapped between hills and water. 15,000 men died in under 4 hours, and thousands more drowned trying to swim away. The lake reportedly turned red. Rome had now lost 2 entire armies in a matter of months, and the panic in the city was not exaggeration. People were fleeing. The Senate was in emergency session. Hannibal was less than 100 miles from Rome itself, and everyone knew it.
This is the exact moment Rome did something it hadn't done in over a century. It appointed a dictator, a real constitutional emergency measure that handed one man near total authority for up to 6 months when the Republic faced true
existential danger. The man they chose was Quintus Fabius Maximus, already in his 60s, which in the ancient world made him a genuinely old man. He was a former consul, deeply religious, and someone who had spent decades watching Roman armies succeed and fail in equal measure. History would eventually attach the nickname Concator to his name, meaning the delayer. And trust me, when it was first used, nobody meant it as a compliment.
Fabius looked at the situation with the kind of cold, clear thinking that so often gets mistaken for weakness by people who don't actually have it. He understood a few brutal truths immediately. Hannibal's army was terrifyingly good in open-pitched battle, especially his cavalry, which completely outclassed anything Rome could field. Hannibal was also operating deep inside enemy territory without a dependable supply line, which meant time itself was working against him, not for him. He needed either a knockout blow that forced Rome to negotiate, or he needed Rome's Italian allies to abandon her entirely. Neither of those things would happen while his army was quietly starving in the background. So Fabius made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He decided not to fight. Instead, he took his army into the hills, shadowing Hannibal's every movement without ever engaging directly. He cut off foraging parties. He picked apart isolated detachments. He struck at supply lines whenever the opportunity appeared. But he refused again and again every single invitation to meet Hannibal on open, flat terrain, where that devastating cavalry would tear the Romans apart. The rough hill country of central Italy became his battlefield instead, terrain that neutralized Hannibal's greatest advantage and forced his army to scatter in search of food, which made them vulnerable in a completely different way. Most importantly, it bought time, the one resource Hannibal could never replace, no matter how brilliant he was on the battlefield.
Here's the problem with brilliant strategy, though. It often looks like weakness to everyone watching from the outside. And that's exactly what happened to Fabius. Almost immediately, people started whispering that their general was simply too afraid to fight a foreign invader on Roman soil. Hannibal, who understood psychology almost as well as he understood warfare, sensed an opportunity to defeat Fabius without ever meeting him on a battlefield at all. He marched his army through some of the richest farmland in Italy, burning and looting everything in his path. But he very deliberately spared one estate completely untouched, the estate belonging to Fabius Maximus himself. The message landed exactly as intended. Either Fabius was a coward abandoning his own people, or somehow he had a secret arrangement with the enemy. And Rome's citizens, watching their farms burn while their own army sat idle in the hills, began to genuinely wonder which one was true.
Fabius's own second-in-command, a man named Marcus Minucius Rufus, made his contempt for the strategy loud and public. He wanted action. He said so constantly. And when Fabius briefly left to handle religious duties back in Rome, Minucius took troops out and engaged part of Hannibal's army, scoring what looked like a small victory. Rome absolutely lost its mind with excitement. The public pressure became so intense that Minucius was actually elevated to equal authority alongside Fabius, a workaround that essentially undermined the entire point of appointing a dictator in the first place. Think about that for a second. Rome had found a political loophole to override its own emergency measure, because that measure was, in their eyes, too patient and too boring for the moment they thought they were living through. To his enormous credit, Fabius did not panic or lash out. He watched Minucius carefully, patiently, waiting for the inevitable. And sure enough, Hannibal, who had been studying Minucius's impulsiveness just as closely, set an elaborate trap, positioning a hidden force in terrain that looked deceptively favorable for an attack. Minucius took the bait immediately, charged forward, and found himself completely surrounded, moments from total annihilation. Only the sudden arrival of Fabius and the rest of the Roman army saved him and his men from being wiped out entirely. Minucius, reportedly, returned command to Fabius on the spot, calling him his father in recognition of the debt he now owed him. It was total, undeniable vindication of the exact strategy everyone had mocked for months. And yet, Fabius's 6-month term as dictator was about to expire regardless, and Roman politics simply wasn't built for this kind of patience.
When Fabius stepped down, Rome elected 2 new consuls to take command, and one of them, Gaius Terentius Varro, was openly, aggressively hostile to everything Fabius stood for. He had reportedly campaigned on a promise to end the chase, stop hiding in the hills, and finally bring Hannibal to a decisive battle where Rome's superior numbers would simply overwhelm him through brute force. The other consul, Aemilius Paulus, actually had some sympathy for the Fabian approach and its underlying logic. But under Roman military tradition, command alternated daily between the 2 consuls. And on the day it was Varro's turn, near the town of Cannae, in August of 216 BC, he gave the order that Fabius had spent years trying to prevent.
That detail matters enormously, because Hannibal had picked flat, open terrain, perfect for cavalry. And that day, a hot, dusty wind blew directly into the faces of the advancing Roman soldiers. Hannibal placed his weaker allied infantry deliberately in the center of his formation, saving his best troops for the flanks, with devastating cavalry anchoring both wings. When the massive Roman legions charged forward, they pushed straight into that soft, yielding center, which bent inward but never fully broke, gradually pulling the entire Roman army deeper and deeper into a shrinking pocket. Then, Hannibal's hardened veterans on both sides swung inward like a closing door, while his cavalry, having already crushed the Roman horsemen, swept around from behind to seal the trap completely.
What followed wasn't really a battle anymore, in any traditional sense. It became a slow, methodical slaughter that stretched across most of the afternoon, with Roman soldiers packed so tightly together in the encirclement that many couldn't even raise their weapons to defend themselves. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans died that single day, including a sitting consul, roughly 80 senators, and hundreds of men from Rome's administrative and officer class. Varro, the man who ordered the attack, survived and fled the field. When news reached Rome, the city descended into something close to total collective breakdown. And several allied cities across Italy, sensing Roman weakness for the first time, began quietly considering whether loyalty to Rome was still worth the cost. And here's where the story takes its most fascinating turn. After the battle, Hannibal's officers reportedly urged him to march immediately on Rome itself, while the city was still in chaos and the road lay completely open. Hannibal refused. His own cavalry commander is said to have told him that he knew how to win a victory, but not how to actually use one. And whether that exact conversation happened word for word or not, the strategic reality afterward was undeniable. Hannibal never marched on Rome, partly because he lacked the heavy siege equipment needed to break through the city's walls, and partly because he was still hoping Rome's allies would defect on their own without forcing him into a costly siege he couldn't easily win. Cannae, for all its horror, turned out to be a spectacular tactical victory that led absolutely nowhere strategically.
And now, finally, painfully, Rome began listening to Fabius. He wasn't reappointed dictator this time, but his entire approach quietly became official Roman policy for the rest of the war in Italy. No more massive pitched battles on open terrain. Instead, harassment, attrition, cutting supply lines, and letting Hannibal's army slowly grind itself down while Rome rebuilt its strength behind the scenes. Fabius himself returned to active command, methodically retaking cities that had defected in the aftermath of Cannae, moving with the same patient precision that had defined his entire career. Meanwhile, the mass defections Hannibal had been counting on never fully materialized, and reinforcements from Carthage arrived far too slowly and far too thin to change anything meaningful on the ground.
Hannibal spent over a decade in Italy after this, winning nearly every major engagement he fought, and somehow losing the war anyway, which is the single strangest sentence you can write about ancient military history. This is the Fabian paradox in its purest, most brutal form. The man who never once defeated Hannibal directly on a battlefield was actually winning the entire war, while the brilliant tactician who crushed Rome at Trebia, at Trasimene, and at Cannae was slowly, quietly losing everything that mattered. Strategy and tactics are simply different games, played on different timelines, and strategy, given enough patience, tends to beat tactics almost every single time history has tested the theory.
A younger Roman general named Scipio had been studying this entire campaign with obsessive intensity, having personally survived Cannae as a young officer and absorbed every lesson it offered. He drew a conclusion that built directly on Fabian logic while pushing it in a bolder direction entirely. If Hannibal couldn't be defeated inside Italy and waiting him out could take another generation, then the answer was to attack Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy and rush home to defend his own city on Rome's terms instead of his own. In 204 BC, against considerable political resistance, Scipio landed in North Africa, and it worked exactly as he'd hoped. Hannibal was recalled after 15 years abroad, undefeated in Italy through force of arms alone, an almost unbelievable achievement that ultimately meant nothing.
At Zama, in 202 BC, Scipio met Hannibal on the battlefield, having carefully studied and essentially reverse-engineered the very tactics that made Cannae so devastating. Hannibal's veteran infantry fought brilliantly, as they always had, but without his once dominant cavalry advantage, the battle slowly tipped against him, and Rome finally won its decisive victory. Fabius Maximus died just months before Zama, having lived long enough to see Rome's eventual triumph become all but certain. Reportedly dying in genuine poverty because he'd sold his own land to ransom Roman prisoners, and the Senate had simply never paid him back. He'd been consul 5 separate times and dictator twice, and spent most of those years being quietly called a coward by people whose own armies got destroyed precisely because they refused to listen to him.
The Fabian strategy never really died with him, though. It's been rediscovered again and again by commanders facing the exact same brutal asymmetry, an enemy who dominates in direct confrontation but remains strategically fragile over a long, grinding war. George Washington faced this precise dilemma during the American Revolution. Unable to consistently beat British regulars in open battle, so he largely refused that fight entirely, choosing to reign carefully, retreating when necessary, and slowly wearing down British willingness to continue the war, rather than trying to destroy their army outright. His critics called him Fabius too, and they certainly didn't mean it kindly, but history eventually judged that comparison as one of the highest compliments a commander could receive. That same underlying insight keeps resurfacing because the underlying truth behind it never actually goes away. Tactical brilliance is not the same thing as strategic wisdom, and winning individual fights is not remotely the same as winning the larger war. Sometimes the single most courageous decision a leader can make is simply refusing to fight the battle everyone else desperately wants. There's a very particular, very lonely kind of courage required to sit perfectly still while your allies are burning around you, while political rivals are calling you a coward in public, while your own officers are demanding immediate action, and while the enemy marches unchecked through your richest land. That kind of pressure has quietly destroyed far more armies throughout history than enemy cavalry ever managed to.
Fabius absorbed that exact pressure for years without breaking, because he'd seen enough Roman overconfidence in his lifetime to know precisely what it eventually produces. He had the patience, the political toughness, and the strategic clarity to hold his course when almost nobody standing around him actually believed he was right. And then Cannae happened, and suddenly, tragically, everyone believed him completely. That might be the single most bitter detail in this entire story. He was right from the very beginning. He explained his reasoning clearly. He proved it worked repeatedly in the hills above the Italian countryside. And Rome still had to lose 50,000 men in a single catastrophic afternoon before anyone truly accepted that the patient old general in the hills understood the war better than anyone else standing in Rome at that moment.
If you could sit down with Fabius today and ask him directly what he actually learned from all of this, the answer probably wouldn't be complicated at all. Know exactly what your enemy is genuinely good at, and know precisely where your own weaknesses actually lie. Never fight on ground that favors the other side. Protect what you have above almost everything else, because something alive that hasn't won yet is always worth more than something destroyed while trying. Be patient, stubbornly, almost unreasonably patient, and let time quietly work in your favor while everyone around you demands instant results. And if people call you a coward for waiting, that's fine, because given enough time, the results usually speak for themselves far louder than any critic ever could. Hannibal Barca may have been the single greatest battlefield tactician who ever lived, undefeated for 15 straight years deep inside enemy territory, and he still lost the entire war